This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
I'd like to welcome Mike and Judy. Thank you. And they're going to talk to us about the Maxilla Nursery Centre.
That's right, yeah.
In its context and as an account of its history.
Mm-hmm.
Not right?
That's right, yeah. It's a story of me being involved as a activist and trustee in Maxilla Nursery Centre, which is in Notting Hill or North Kensington, whichever way you prefer to talk about the area, which opened in 1978 and closed in July 2015. I'm not. When I've given talks on some other times about how I got involved in voluntary organisations, I've said it's because in 1972 my friend Judy asked me to write a press release for a campaign for a nursery centre. So thank you, Judy. Yes. Judy then was the you were community worker for the People's Association at the time. I'll talk about the People's Association briefly later, and then became the coordinator of the nursery centre. So I said she should come tonight to take the blame for everything I've done since 1972. When we discuss things, Judy can answer the difficult questions. But the other thing that's happening now is that Judy and I are involved in helping set up a website which is going to record and celebrate the history of Maxilla Nursery, supported by a grant from the Heritage Lottery Fund. Which Lisa Nash, working with the Corner 9 Arts project, achieved that grant from Heritage Lottery Fund, so that's terrific. Lisa would have liked to be here tonight, but sends her apologies and can't make it. So as it turns out, although this wasn't in mind when we first talked about me doing this little talk, one of the sort of functions of this evening is actually helping to get some of this history together and actually remember it, I think. So Judy and I have been spending quite a lot of time trying to remember what happened since 1972 for the website and for the history. And maybe in time for the, it should be in time for the conference in July. This website is meant to be functioning in the spring, which will be a record of the creation of this nursery centre and its context in the community of Notting Hill, North Kensington. So I'm going to talk about the history in that sort of longish kind of view of community organisation in Notting Hill. I'm going to start in the 1950s, which is a bit ambitious. But what I'd like to think really is that somebody somewhere is going to pick this up as a proper history. So you better tell your friends that there's a real history to be written somewhere, or a PhD to be done, or something like that. And also to talk about the relationships between the voluntary organisation and the local authorities, and that, I hope, triggers some thoughts about the role of voluntary organisations in progressing social policy. I'll say a little bit about its significance for me being involved in all this as a witness and participant. We'll see how the time goes. So what I'm going to do is, kind of like section by section, is first of all talk about the sort of setting up of Maxilla Nursery Centre in the 1972 to 1978 period and some of the key features of that. Then backtrack into history of other things that were done in the community in Notting Hill, North Kensington, and then kind of come forward again, picking up from sort of the 1980s through to the present and how the policy environment that the nursery was working within changed during that time. And then a few words about my own position, and then finish in the summer of 2015. I'm not sure if everybody knows where we're talking about, so this is the only visual aid, is where this all happens. And sorry for the very crude diagram, but if you know where Notting Hill Gate is, down in that corner there, and Shepherd's Bush is over there, you've got Holland Park Avenue running along between them. You've got Ladbroke Grove coming north-south up the middle, and over the top of North Kensington you've got the elevated motorway, the Westway, which leads down to the M40 into Marylebone, High Street that way, Portobello Road, roughly around there, and the nursery we're talking about is here, underneath the motorway, more or less. Okay, so I thought maybe, so you know roughly where we are. And So yes, the place where it is, after it was called Maxilla Nursery, I realised the reason why was we put it in a small park, which was called Maxilla Park. And it was called Maxilla because it's the shape of a jawbone. You'll maybe know. I don't think I knew it. No, it was nothing to do with us. I think the fire brigade insisted it was called something like that, wasn't it, or something like that?
Well, it was the GLC.
That was the GLC. Sorry, GLC. Yes. Okay. Right. So back to 1972. And one fateful day, you said, "Come along and write a press release." What had happened was that a local voluntary organisation, which is called the People's Association, and as I said, Judy was its community work, had done a survey of the needs of children under 5 and their parents in North Kensington, which showed a desperate lack of facilities for care and education for the under 5s. A huge amount in an area of great overcrowding and poverty, mostly actually on this side of that, actually, in that bit there. And the particular problem, among all the other problems really, was that that's what services were offered or could be offered for under 5s didn't fit in with the lives of families with working parents, whether there was a single parent or whether it was a family with 2 parents, both of whom were working. And the People's Association had been working for a few years campaigning and setting up playgroups to tackle some appalling stories of the conditions that childminders were in which childminders were keeping children in kind of darkened rooms and more or less not exactly tied-in cots, but I mean there's some horrible stories. And so it was campaigning very hard on under 5s facilities, and brought together a group of people to pick up the issues out of this survey of people's needs and to campaign for improving under 5 services which would meet the needs of local families. And what we saw then, when we discussed it and looked around the kind of services there were for under 5s, was in some ways it's not that different from what it is now, that you would have nursery education, which is for 3 to 5-year-olds, run by local education authorities, offering education in school hours, very often only half day at a time for children, keeping to school terms and school holidays. And so even though the quality of the provision was generally good, the pattern in which it was provided, the half days and the holidays and so on, were impossible for working parents, or put working parents under huge stress in trying to keep in with that kind of pattern of education. Alongside that, you have the daycare services, mostly for 0 to 3s, though some of it would run into the older ones as well, run by social services departments, which did provide all day, all year care, and so fitted in with working parents. But generally the provision was of pretty low quality, and you also had to be some kind of priority case to get into it. And then the third kind of provision at the time, well actually there was, as well as the childminders, which I put aside for a moment, were playgroups, which was the kind of the 1960s, 1970s thing really. It was much strongly growing movement of voluntary organisations and parents volunteering, providing for sort of part-time places for the children. And so what our group thought was that what we needed was the kind of the best of all those facilities. It would provide the quality and the focus on child development which you could get from nursery education. It would provide full day, full year provision like you would get if you were in daycare, and it would provide parent participation and support for the parents like you would get and be inspired by from the playgroup movement. I can't go into the sort of whole range of policy issues on at the time in this kind of chat, but we heard there were discussions of this kind going on in other parts of the country about how to meet this kind of the needs of people and to somehow provide a service which better met the need of working parents and their children. The educationist called Jack Tizard, who some of you might remember, was developing this kind of service in Thomas Coram Children's Centre near King's Cross, and then he went on to set up a centre called the Dorothy Gardner Centre, which is still there in North Westminster. And but it was mostly Judy and other members of the group made contact with those developments and talked to various sort of local authorities and so on who were moving in that direction. There was a campaign group which included some, I don't know whether I was a representative of the local community, I was a local resident anyway, and some people who said they were the community. There were the Borough Social Services Officer, representative of the Nursery Schools Association, representatives of preschool playgroups, and the Adult Education Institute. And I think the key point for the people from the community was to push the case and campaign, but the key point for the professional staff was that, like the borough and I'll say in a moment from the Education Authority, the key point for the professional staff was that by working with a voluntary organisation, they could make progress and innovate in a way they couldn't do at the time in working with their own statutory agencies. So the voluntary organisation offered the opportunity to innovate. The Education Authority at the time, of blessed memory, was the Inner London Education Authority, which you remember ran the education for the Inner London boroughs. And I think in the brief story anyway, that the officers of ILIA took to the idea very readily and quickly, keen probably to get involved with the grassroots group and knowing that was the kind of thing they should be doing. And I can't remember the sort of the who said what to who kind of thing, but basically, fairly readily, they said they would build and run a nursery school as part of a combined centre which we could set up. And more than that, they gave us an architect, a man called Barry Wilson, who we've now tracked down after some years. And Barry Wilson, who was a GLC ILIA architect, worked to us, the voluntary organisation, treating us as the client, and designed the whole centre as well as the kind of the education bit of it, as it were, for free. So there was a time of generosity from the local authorities, from ILIA's point of view particularly. Meanwhile, the borough, that's the Royal Borough of Kensington, Chelsea that we're talking about here, their officers also saw it as a good way to tackle the kind of social problems that were being presented in this North Kensington area. And together with us, we managed to get an urban aid programme. So the borough were very lucky. They only had to pay for 25% of the costs of their side of it, and central government paid for 75% under the urban aid programme. So we could see in this campaign group, and ILIA was going to provide a school. Through urban aid we were going to get the day nursery bit, but the basic idea that we wanted was the parental involvement, and where was the parent hub of the centre, which was going to be for parents coming from. And at that point, a man called Colin Lowndes, which perhaps I should say that a millionaire called Colin Lowndes, walked into ILIA, or approached ILIA, said he'd like to help fund a nursery school. And ILIA said, sorry, you can't actually put money into one of our nursery schools, but our friend Judy has got a plan, as it were. And so he put up a grant which was sufficient to build the hub at the centre, for the Parents Centre, from his Vanessa Lowndes Trust. I think what he had in mind, he had a daughter who's a friend still, called Vanessa, who is blind. He'd visited, I think, a nursery in, I believe, Fulham called Vanessa, which was named after Vanessa Redgrave. And I think somewhere in his mind was that he could provide a framework and something where his daughter could get involved with the kind of the echo of the two Vanessas. Yes. And so he came up with this £50,000 to build correct me when I get the things wrong, please, dear, to pay for the building. And he continued as a benefactor for years afterwards, kind of pulling his chequebook out when we needed a bit of money for that kind of thing. And so there we were in 1978, able to open a purpose-built combined nursery centre, which was going to be open 50 weeks of the year, 8 in the morning till 6 in the evening. Not every child, most children didn't do the whole hours, obviously, but it fitted in with working parents. And at the centre of it, a parents' centre, it's like the hub around which everything else went. And in the parents' centre, there would be parents' activities, and particularly there'd be a toy library, which would be kind of useful in the kind of outreach sense in terms of the Maxilla Nursery Centre. The day nursery was 30, wasn't it, under 3s or thereabouts? 36 under 3s, under a coordinator. And it was run by the charity that we created during those few years when we realised we needed some legal protection and couldn't just go on as an informal group, which was called the Westway Nursery. It was called the Westway Nursery Association, and had an executive for Westway Nursery Association, and then under that a management committee for the Nursery Centre. I was chair of it at that time, so that's how I got involved. And that was funded by the Borough Social Services. The charity also ran the Parents Centre with charitable funding. And then alongside that, in the same building, was a nursery school run by ILIA, with 2 classes of 25 children from memory, 3 to 5 year olds, and its own governing body. And it was a compromise, of course, because the best way of doing it would have been for ILIA to say, here's the money, you can run the school, and then it would have been a really unified centre. But they said that wasn't possible. So there was a school and a day nursery and everything else alongside each other, and much depended on the kind of personal working relationship then between the coordinator of the charity side and the head teacher, and that worked for a good many years. And the willingness as well of the school staff to work to a year-round full-day schedule and taking holidays and everything, but not to the regular pattern of the school year. So it's pretty radical, really. It was Trailblazer. There were 2 others opened about the same time, both run by local authorities in Coventry, Hillfields, and in Hartcliffe, Bristol. We remembered the names the other day. And masses of sort of visitors coming in from overseas in the UK to see what was going on. Claimed that out of this was a model for the Sure Start nurseries and centres and children's centres and extended hours, which came in with the Blair government much later. And in all ways, a sort of trailblazer, and we'll have to do more justice to its history another time, but created by community action out of the initiative from the community and voluntary organisations in the community. And so I suppose the question to kind of think about is how we had the capacity to do that and to set up this place. So I want to just quickly track back in time to what had gone on in Notting Hill, North Kensington before. And this was way before I got involved. I mean, I did nothing in the community until a fateful day, as I said, when this area, what we got there, if we go back to the 1950s, go back to the 19th century, it's predominantly, if you remember, was built for the prosperous middle classes and their servants in the middle of the 19th century in very sort of beautiful kind of estate fashion, mostly very solid 4-storey townhouses. And by the 1950s, whilst kind of the middle area and down the bottom end there of Ladbroke Grove was still pretty prosperous, you could go 2 or 3 or 3 or 4 streets either way and be in areas of huge overcrowding and poverty. I don't know if anybody saw, the BBC has had occasional series called The Secret History of Our Streets. Yeah. And there was one on Portland Road, which is just about there. And that showed living in this house, which now these days you'd have to pay 3 or 4 million for. I think it was 80-something people living in the house, like a family to a room, extraordinary poverty, and I couldn't bring it up to get it online anymore, but and a largely white working class, and so huge pressure of poverty, accommodation, and then added to that racial tensions coming into the area. Basically, like in Portland Road, it looked anyway it's like a predominantly white working class group. The key event, looking back, seems to be the Notting Hill race riots of September 1958, which were fighting in the streets between white groups and black groups. More, I think, actually young white men going out to look for black people they could beat up. And alongside that, in those years, this is all skimmed over, and I've had to say a lot of this I don't know, and please be a historian, where we're going to find the person who does the history. The racial tensions in the area were stoked up by the landlords, particularly by a man called Peter Rackman, who gave his name to Rackmanism. And he had a lot of property more on this side of the road, really, where he was intimidating tenants and exploiting racial tension to drive people, particularly out of protected tenancies where the rents were protected, and kind of crowding people in and oppressing people and generally worsening housing conditions. And so that was happening in the kind of end of the 50s, beginning of the 60s. I was surprised to see that Rackman actually died in 1963, it says in my notes, or 62. So he wasn't responsible for all that's been put to his name. But somehow or other, and I don't know how, and I don't know who does know how, out of that, during the 1960s, there was an extraordinary upsurge of community initiatives in this area to combat these kind of problems. Most visibly and obviously now, the Notting Hill Carnival. First idea for it actually came up as early as January 1950. 1959, but then the Carnival really got going out of Ronnie Laslet's effort from the fair and festival in September 1966, leading to the Notting Hill Carnival we have now. 1960, I can only give you these quick notes. 1960, the Notting Hill Social Council was formed, which is the model really for councils for voluntary service across the country, as far as I can see. Do challenge me. Notting Housing Trust wasn't the first housing trust, was it? But it was the kind of one that most seized the kind of political initiative in terms of dealing with poverty and overcrowding. 1963. North Kensington Law Centre, the first law centre in the country, in 1970. I think the first adventure playground, the North Kensington Play Space, in 1970 or 1971. That kind of seems to be sort of, I mean, maybe if you don't have such a North Kensington-centric view, you can tell us about other things, but it's pretty extraordinary sort of set of kind of institutions being created out of this scene. In 1965, there was something called the Community Workshop. A man called George Clark was the key mover in that, and leading in 66, 67, 68 to what was called the Summer Project, which did a huge and authoritative survey of the slum housing in the area. It was also a kind of a huge sort of cultural radicalism going on at the moment, and some people claim it was when the Pink Floyd would change from being a rhythm and blues band to psychedelia, so you can see, you get the feel. Anyway, you know, it's the sort of thing I wish I'd been there, really. But and out of the community workshop came the People's Association, who kicked off the nursery campaign. There, a few people, particularly John and Jan O'Malley, who started working, giving advice to the people in the housing accommodation here, the kind of advising the tenants in their oppression and exploitation, running advice centres, trying to resolve individual problems, and also campaigning on general issues. And as I said, kind of out of that, providing playgroups to combat the problems of the childminders operating outside the law, and also the road accidents. The number of children were being hurt in road accidents because there was nowhere to play. So they were opening up the garden squares, particularly around that part of the area as well. And so there it was, out of the work of the People's Association came Maxilla Nursery. The other key event was the building of this motorway across, which cut through the communities. There were many community ideas about how the land under the motorway could be used. Michael Heseltine, indeed, did open it in July 1970, to be met by people who found a way onto the motorway by the cunning process, I understand from reading it, of going the wrong way up a slip road. And so they blocked the road and sat down and stopped the motorway being used. And out of that, a compromise was reached between the borough and the community, and that is that the land under this raised motorway should be made available for the benefit of the community. And the body called the North Kensington Amenity Trust, which is now called the Westway Trust, was set up to develop the land for the benefit of the community. And there's a whole other history in that bit. But so it was there, on their land, on the land they ran, that there was space to build Maxilla Nursery. So as I said, all this had happened before I got involved, and I kind of, by being involved in the campaign for the nursery, got involved in this strange, heady world of community politics and trying to, understand what had gone on before and how it had all happened. What you got then by the early 70s was a body of people in the area, groups, networks, who had got commitment, ideology, experience and skills in protesting and organising that, in effect, although I don't think I quite knew what was happening at the time, gave a body like ours something to build on, and people who knew their sort of the ropes, as it were, around this. And people who got used to both putting pressure on the borough and then finding the point at which you could work in partnership with the local authorities as well. So there was a lot of what I guess we now analyse as social capital and infrastructure. Do we still use the word social capital? Well, that's 5 years ago, whatever it is. And there were these people who'd earned their stripes, as it were, their credibility through leading some of these initiatives, maybe sitting down when the motorway was going to be opened, creating community provision, housing advice, play-based playgroups. A pretty sort of, what word shall I use? Strange group of individuals somehow, and I don't think I ever spoke to any one of these key figures directly, and I don't think they'd have ever given me the time of day if they had, because the fairly individualistic, mostly left-wing, occasionally egocentric, liking each other and loathing each other in sort of equal measure. Some of them were members of the Labour Party. The Labour Party as such, as a thing in itself, wasn't influential in all of this. They variously looked to Karl Marx, Saul Alinsky and the French New Left for their inspiration. The most constant ones in my experience were our friends from the liberal wing of the Communist Party, who were kind of the mainstay of this, so far as I was concerned. And then a good spattering of Methodist ministers. And so you had this sort of strange mixture of people, and when I was trying to do a roll call and work out who they all were, and some people who just, like particularly I think of Pat MacDonald, who just were local residents who just knew something had to be done and got on with it, really. So politics then, looking back, I think is kind of like is quite interesting of working, well, it would be interesting of working it out properly, of was a politics of dissent and protest, as you can tell, and of campaigning for public services. You know, money should be spent, service, housing, nurseries, whatever, should be improved. Much of it, I realise now, had been initiated and developed, first of all, as giving practical advice and help, like with housing advice in the People's Association, with legal advice and so on. And then it was more than, as it were, just a demand for public services, in the sense that it was a campaign aimed at central and local government for better provision. It was much more than that. It was a campaign to show that the community could then run things themselves. So that it was important through the politics of this that people could show that, in a sense, there was the power to the people, and so when we came to think about, work on the campaign for this nursery, I don't remember it being argued, but it was the way in which it evolved. It wasn't just going to the borough and say, you should do it. It was, we can do it, and we can show as a community that we can run a nursery. The key text on this is The Politics of Community Action by Jan O'Malley, in Spokesman Books, which I think you can still get it, but I've lost my copy, I've discovered, doing this. So the outcome of our research and analysis in this campaign for the nursery was that we could identify the needs, we could find out what was current thinking about under fives provision and nurseries. And we wouldn't just say to the council or Ilya, you should run it, but show that the community could do it. I suppose myself, without kind of thinking at any kind of great depth about the politics, was a much more sort of pragmatist, I guess. I assumed that we would create this nursery. At some point, obviously, public services would go on expanding, the welfare state would grow, and at some point the local authority would take over the nursery, and we as volunteers, charitable workers, activists, whatever, would move on to something else. But as you know, that isn't how things have worked out. Tried to kind of characterise what it was like a bit, and what sort of forces there were. I mean, I think there's a desperate need, and I can't, for somebody to do a history like this. We might, after we've done I think one or two people after we've done the history website for the nursery, see if we can do one, or get people together to do one for the broader community history. But it would be worth some historians' work to kind of trace how people actually did these things, at least before they all die. Anyway, to be practical about it in terms of history. Okay, so turn then to the period after with the nursery established, looking through from the 80s, 90s onwards to now. The other side of the balance, I mentioned about the kind of the commitment in community politics for showing the community could do it and get on with do the reforms ourselves, as it were, was the political control of the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea, which you'll know, I think, was controlled by the Conservative Party, and as far as anybody can tell, always will be controlled by the Conservative Party. But at that time, anyway, it was a rather special kind of conservatism, I think. It was perhaps paternalistic, patriarchal, I'm not sure quite what the word is. It was as though they were happy for the community to get on and run things. I mean, providing they weren't actually putting council money to Marxists and anarchists, or at least people could cover up that they were Marxists and anarchists. It was fun. They were willing to fund and saw the way of tackling the problems of the area as being through community and voluntary organisations. I did myself sometimes wonder if they didn't see us a bit like they might have seen a colonised people in Africa. And, you know, it was quite good that we should be encouraged into self-government or something like that. But so, whereas as well as I said, like the council officers could see working through a voluntary organisation was a way of getting social progress and innovation. Also the councillors, perhaps less committed as it were to innovation in some, maybe, why should I say that, I don't know, but could still see that supporting voluntary organisations was the way of getting the community to meet its own needs. And at that time, going back to the end of the 70s, early 80s, what they were doing was accepting broadly our identification of the needs and our proposals for how to meet them. They were funding our agenda, as it were. And I think that's the key thing that changed going on into the 1980s and the change over time. I mean, Lisa, who's doing the history website, asked us to do a timeline, and Judy and me have been trying to remember what happened at various times. But I don't think there was a kind of, year by year change. It was more like a kind of slow tightening of the screw over time, I think, and of change. I mean, one change was the abolition of the Inner London Education Authority and Greater London Council in March 1986, which, at least if you looked at it from outside, you'd have thought, well, that could have been a useful thing, because that brought the education and the social services under borough control, and who knows, that might have made the nursery kind of more combined even than it had been, with the sort of separate local authorities on the two of them. But I think our experience was that the education department and the social services department in the borough weren't in kind of constant communication with each other, and they mostly talked to each other via the voluntary organisations they were supporting. So again, there was the kind of the function of the voluntary organisation in helping the local authority work coherently. I think, as a kind of approaching it from the outside policy point of view, a key event would have been the 1990 NHS and Community Care Act and the preceding Griffiths report, which legislated really for what we then called the contract culture, and for for voluntary organisations being funded through subcontract and contracting with their local authorities. I don't know that we can recall that, as it were, hitting us at the time. One of our friends recalls that there was a meeting when the borough called in the voluntary organisations to explain to them that it would be less grant giving in future and much more contracting, the way in which you get funded. But we haven't managed to fix the date when that actually happened yet. And again, I don't think it was a sort of, it's this way and then it's the other way. It was a slow process of change. And away from what I said, as we started, it was the borough supporting us in meeting the needs we'd identified and meeting the needs in the way in which we thought they should be met. And increasingly during the late 80s and into the 90s, it was the voluntary organisation, being seen to do the council's business, funded to carry through the council's agenda. I mean, one issue like that, though again we've got to remember when it actually happened, was that we'd operated the nursery on the basis of a catchment area, not wanting it to be a matter of the only people who got in were the ones who were priorities. And at some point the borough said, this is our money, we want you to take our priority cases. And I think we found a bit of a way around it, but there was that kind of pressure of having to take priority children into the nursery. And in a way that was a compromise with our principles of open access from a catchment area. Of course, during this period, excuse me, there was the slow reduction in public finances going on all the time. And you started hearing councillors saying things like, "He who pays the piper calls the tune." And a councillor visited and said it was a Rolls-Royce service in the nursery, but that was pejorative. You know, it would Vauxhall Cavalier or whatever it was, it would have been plenty good enough for them. And so you get that kind of tightening of the screw, I think, and it would be. We need to do more work, I think, and hope on kind of identifying what happened there when. So the history of the 1990s, I think, I wasn't as much in, I don't think I was at all involved in the 1990s, was I? I drifted off or something by then. But leaving Judy yes, and other committee members, yes. So process of reduced funding from the borough for the under threes side, on the sort of the charitable side in terms of parents' activities and so on, having to look more for funding from charities, having to always, this the usual story of voluntary organisation through that period, trying to invent things that would bring in funding from charities all the time. And at the same time it was harder because the nursery wasn't as new or as unique as it had been, and so the constant pressure to try and get it funded and to kind of get by. I think maybe a key event, almost the last straw that broke the back, was maybe, arguably anyway, in 1999 was Tony Blair's government's policy to increase access to under 5 services, which sort of paradoxically perhaps, but was by introducing family tax credits, which put the system of funding nursery education, under 5s education care, onto parents paying, helped out by their tax credits. This isn't very exact, I'm sorry, but it was something like this. So that the council then could argue, we don't need to give you as much money because you should be charging the parents, and the parents should have their tax credits to help them out of that. That ran against the principle that we had, that it should basically be, as far as we could, be a free service. And so there's a way in which I think we didn't kind of play ball or want to play ball with the council, but it added to the pressure on the charity side. And the charity, the Westway Nursery Association, this charity we created to run the whole thing, to oversee the whole thing, overarch, realised that it was drawing on its reserves. We had early on put aside 3 months reserves, unlike some charities that we've been in the news recently, so that we had a sort of reserves to kind of tide us over. But the reserves, as it were running out, and by the summer of 2006 the charity had to decide it couldn't keep going and withdrew out of the Nursery Centre October 2006, and the charity was closed down, leaving the borough to carry on running the nursery school side. I did try and close it down as well, but pressure from other people kept it going, with some kind of parents and children's support to make it a kind of children's centre. So it was still a pretty lively place, but it wasn't the kind of comprehensive combined centre that it had been. Until July 2015, when the borough closed it completely. Well, actually, I'm not meant to say it closed it completely, because strictly speaking, what it did was federate it with a school, another nursery school, a smaller school, the other side of Ladbroke Grove. So, but anyway, it closed Maxilla Nursery. Perhaps I should say a word then about the sort of, before I come back to the kind of the current situation. Meant to be a witness seminar. I thought I should say a bit about me, because I think I wondered why I was involved in it. I mean, why did it happen to me, kind of thing. I mean, I wasn't a parent, not at that time. I was local, lived in the area. Though I remember a friend once saying to me that why did I have to walk 15 minutes down Ladbroke Grove to get to my community, and because it wasn't sort of quite on my doorstep. I suppose, like most volunteers, I was asked to get involved, and so I did, and carried on. And I had some skills, writing, committee work. I was writing more and doing more research about education at the time, so I did actually understand at that time anyway some of the education arguments that were going on. And I guess I was a safe pair of hands in a kind of way. And I agreed with what we were doing, of course. but I think I was always a bit in awe of those people and felt at a disadvantage about the kind of the real community leaders, the people who had actually sat down on the motorway, you know, or who had been in the People's Association, and the kind of extraordinary effort and power of will that they'd had to kind of get some of those things going. Felt maybe a bit like a sort of apparatchik in a sort of post-revolutionary situation, sort of keeping it going after the changes had been made. One of the satisfying and fun things about it was also being able to talk about ourselves as a kind of mafia of community contacts, a kind of almost like I guess the sort of wave of people after the 1960s community leaders, where you could kind of talk to your friends and say, well, you don't need to go to the meeting because we've got somebody, one of our other people is at the meeting, you know, and they'll say what they have to say, you know. So it's that sort of feeling about sort of being it all in it together. For me, being involved in this one community organisation, this one community thing, led to others. I'd been chair of the management committee at the beginning of the nursery in 1978. I don't know when it actually started as a committee. Then I was moved on to be chair of the overarching charity Westway Nursery Association, and from that, the Nursery Association set up smaller nurseries as well, and I then had to be the kind of representative on those management committees. And then I was a community rep on the North Kensington Community Trust, which ran the land under the motorway for a while. And before I knew it, really, I was spending 4 nights a week in committee meetings. And was it only 4 nights a week? But the good thing at the time was I was working as a researcher in a polytechnic, a full-time research job, and there was a feeling in higher education at the time, I think, that you had to do something, you could be justified in doing something useful as well as teaching and research. And time was more flexible, and so actually there must have been weeks when I spent more time on community politics than I did on my paid work. But it did also, in terms of the sort of the paid work and the job in North East London Polytechnic, University of East London, lead to something, because it shifted my interest out of writing and doing research on higher education policy into doing work and a series of projects on voluntary organisations and volunteering. And actually the first project that we got, myself and John Griffith, who many, well, you know, anyway, was with the Notting Hill Housing Trust, and I think I might have had a bit of street cred in helping getting the commission on an organisation development project for that. And so we with John, as I said, and other colleagues, built up this work in what became the University of East London, of a sequence of projects, commissions from voluntary organisations and policy issues and so on about voluntary organisations, and a programme of MA and BA programmes. I think that sort of what I'd done here added to my kind of, well, knowledge, obviously, for commitment and sort of credibility, I guess. So actually this as a witness and participant did change my career, did change my life, this involvement. And it's fantastic, always kind of that sense of sort of friendship and belonging and significance of being involved in this, and of being able to walk down the street and kind of see things that you've done. So just to finish, we heard in June this year that some people were running a campaign to keep the nursery school centre as it had become open, as the borough threatened it and carried through closing it, and made contact with the people, or remade contact with the people in the Maxilla Nurseries. It's called Maxilla Nursery Centre. What was it called at that point? Anyway, Maxilla Nursery Children's Centre. Sorry, yeah. And visited. It was the first time I'd been in, I think, since I probably must have come to the 25th anniversary party in, I guess, 2003. So I hadn't been there for a number of years. I can't do the sums there, but by last summer. Judy hadn't been since 2006 when the charity pulled out, and that was absolutely amazing going back. I mean, it was extraordinary. For a start, people came up and spoke to Judy, who'd been parents and even children there who are now working on the staff, and that extraordinary sense of kind of continuity, which was amazing. The children, masses of children out in a garden which had been much developed, and a amazing sort of sense of sort of vibrancy and sort of, you know, quality of work going on there, which was fantastic to kind of, you know, come back and see. And the building is now, I'm not sure what stage it's got to, is being used temporarily as artist studios until some bigger plan for redevelopment. But the garden is being, I think, has it been actually agreed, or it's been, I think, more or less taken over as a kind of shared resource by other nurseries in the area, as and they're partly inspired by an idea which I hadn't come across before, called the Forest School, which is a kind of outdoor education basis, and, you know, exposing children to the wild, letting them get wet and things like that. and so it's extraordinary to see another kind of sort of inspiration come into this, I think. And also to recognise that Lisa Nash, who's got the Heritage Lottery Fund grant, had started as a parent and seen the worth of the place, and so stuck to the commitment through this final time. And so really a sort of an amazing feeling of sort of legacy of spirit living on, and the struggle continues and so on. And there must be a history that somebody could write. Write it. That's me.